Welcome back to the secret world of human trafficking. I'm your host, David J. Story. I'm also the author of the Omega book series. Today we have a special guest. His name is Clifford Brown. He served several positions in USAID down in Africa. He's going to address some issues that he ran into while he was down there working at USAID. Those issues are forced organ harvesting, prostitution, and bride kidnapping. Here we are with Clifford Brown, and what I want you to do, Clifford, is go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, David. I'm happy to have this opportunity. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer and an attorney. I joined the Foreign Aid Agency that was destroyed last year. Back in 1987, I had been a partner in a law firm in Beverly Hills, but I really wanted to work overseas, use my Spanish. I picked that up after college in a fellowship in Latin America. So when I saw that the Agency for International Development, that's AID, but nowadays they call it USAID, they needed attorneys that were willing to go overseas and that had a foreign language. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I spent the next 27 years doing that. I had regional jobs, but I was based in Nairobi, and I traveled all over Africa for 3 years, and then I was transferred back to Central America because that's where the Spanish was that I wanted to use, and I was in Central America for 9 years. I was in Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Again, my job was regional, so I went all over basically giving advice to the missions. USAID was an agency that had people in about 80 countries, and what we would do is we would bring in contractors or non-governmental organizations from the U.S., and they would typically engage in a whole range of activities that our government thought would be useful overseas. I like to say that what we did was everything that was in the middle between military and what embassies do. And we would make jokes that all those people in the embassy, they write cables and they have a lot of meetings, but we get stuff done on the ground. And almost anything was fair game. What people are lamenting most now about the destruction of the agency is the end of our humanitarian work, the disaster responses and the health programs and whatnot. And that's particularly relevant now that there's this Ebola outbreak in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But anyway, I spent almost 3 decades with USAID. About halfway through my career, I stopped being a legal advisor and I moved into management. And after Central America, I was a deputy director for the mission in Bogota, Colombia. We had a big anti-drug program there that was trying to get farmers to grow cocoa or chocolate, the pod that is used to make chocolate, instead of coca, which is used to make cocaine. And then from there, I moved to Kyrgyzstan, where I was the country representative, and we had a big program that did all sorts of things. Kyrgyzstan was one of the former parts of the Soviet Union, so there were many different kinds of programs there to sort of help them along in the path toward private sector economy and whatnot. And then the last place I worked was in, at least as a diplomat, I was in Guinea. I was the mission director for 2 programs. I was based in Conakry, Guinea-Conakry in West Africa, but I was also managing the program in Sierra Leone. We didn't have official staff over there. We had contractors in Sierra Leone, but I could drive there in about 5 hours. So that was the place I retired from. And it's where I learned some of the most horrendous stories about human trafficking that we can get into. I came back to the States. I retired in 2009. I came back to my hometown in Washington State. I practiced law there for a while, a very different kind of law. I had been a commercial business lawyer in California, but I practiced family law and personal bankruptcy work in Washington State. I missed the international world, so I went back myself as a contractor to Peru in 2013, and I was there for 3 years, working again in the counter-drug program, but I wasn't a diplomat. I was a technical advisor to the mission. I left that job at the end of 2016, and I came back to the East Coast instead of going back to Washington State. And I'm a retired attorney here. I'm in the process of getting admitted to the Maryland bar, but I'm not practicing full time. After I left Guinea, I learned from a former colleague in Guinea about some details of what was going on in West Africa, and it was about the human trafficking, not only of the ladies they brought to Africa, but the body parts that they send back to Southeast Asia. And that inspired me to take another job with the American Bar Association, the Rule of Law Initiative, and I was a senior advisor in their technical, their Africa area. And I traveled back and forth to Africa for 1 year with the ABA, trying to get people and donors interested in this subject, and I failed. I could not get people to believe that it was real, or that if they did believe it, they couldn't figure out what they could do about it. So
Yeah.
that's what's
I
inspired me.
found some people just don't want to admit or talk about human trafficking. I had a lady at a book signing I had not too long ago, and she asked me about my books, and I said it about human trafficking, and she just freaked out. She said, "I don't want to talk about it." She turned around. She said, "I don't want to hear anything about it." She just put her hands over her ears and walked out. I thought, well, that's the problem, that no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to address it.
That's exactly.
And that's why it continues to grow.
That's exactly.
Well, go ahead and tell us what you've learned about the human trafficking and the body parts. I mean, that's definitely something that not a lot of people know about.
No, it's well, this is not for kids, but I will get into what I know about it. I was in Guinea at a particularly crazy time. The president had died. Lassana Conte died, and the army couldn't figure out who was going to take charge. So they were in gun battles with each other, and we couldn't go to work. We were hunkered down in our homes for many times, and these battles just raged throughout the city. Well, we had a guy that was our defense attaché officer. He was an army major. He had a budget, and his job was to befriend senior people in the Guinean military, and he had a budget that allowed him to do that. And they loved to come over in his house and have the free drinks and whatnot, even though it's a Muslim nation. Anyway, he was one night down in downtown Conakry with some of these Guinean officers that he was entertaining. And there were two Asian women that came up to him. These ladies did not speak French, and the local dialect was Susu. Of course, they didn't speak that either, but they spoke enough English to tell him their story. And it was basically this. They had been approached in their homelands. One was from the Philippines, one was from Thailand, and they were told that the sailors on these ships, big freighters that carry containers to and from Africa and Southeast Asia. I was a sailor myself, so I could believe this part of the story. There's a lot of room on a ship, especially a freighter, and I had seen guys bring things on that didn't belong on the ship, but I never saw people bring humans. I can believe, though, that they were doing it with these freighters because they were bigger than the one I was on. In any event, these ladies were brought to Africa. They took their passports away from them. They were forced to become prostitutes. So there were homes and it was a business the crewmen were running on the side. The management of the company, these two ladies had come in on a Maersk line. That's a Danish company, but I'm not here to say that Maersk is condoning this or even perhaps aware of it. But in any event, the crewmen most of them were from Southeast Asia, so they could speak the local languages, and they lured these ladies on board. And then they had people that they were cooperating with in the ports. And this does not go on just in Conakry, but in the other major ports in West Africa, it happens there too. And I can talk a little further about corruption in that area and why it's so prevalent. But in any event, the crewmen are afraid to come ashore because of HIV/AIDS. So they have homes for these ladies. They're kept in these homes. They're forced to stay there. They're under house arrest, and they'll work in the bar downstairs or the restaurant. But at night, they'll take them out to the ships on smaller boats, and that's where they ply their trade. Now, when they object, the nice way to put this is they become involuntary organ donors. That means exactly what you can assume it means. These ladies are literally
Wow.
murdered for their body parts. There is another side business that's going on, partly because of so many Chinese construction projects in Africa. The Chinese are building entire soccer stadiums, railroads, roads. They have a lot of, but they bring their own people in. They don't hire the local workers. They bring a whole crew in, and they'll set up a city, and it's like a company town. And there are charter flights that go back and forth to Southeast Asia. Well, those crewmen uh, apparently have discovered these organs, or it was arranged with, maybe they know the crewmen on those ships, but in any event, there is a business that transports the organs back to China. And that that phenomenon is hard for people to believe in the 21st century, but it's been going on for thousands of years, frankly, not the organ part, but the prostitute part. The
Yeah.
organ part is relatively new because you know, they haven't been doing organ transplants too long. There's a book that just came out called "Killed to Order." It came out in early March, and it's about the fact that in China you don't have to wait for an organ transplant. If you've got enough money, there is a kidney available or a liver or whatever, and it's available because, according to the author of that book, it's coming from the prisoners that they have, either the Uyghurs in the far west part of China, the Xinjiang province, or from the Falun Gong. It's a religion of some sort that they declared to be illegal. So those people are also involuntary organ donors. But I personally saw a video of what can happen when they're trying to harvest organs. Now, I should preface this by saying that the sex trade business goes on in both directions. They'll bring Asian women to Africa. They will also take African women to other ports in the Middle East, or Odessa and the Black Sea, and other parts. And so there are African women that are taken overseas, and there are Southeast Asian women that are brought into Africa. I guess the men in the different areas consider the other race a little more exotic, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of money in it. And
Yeah. It's
I saw
growing.
was a young African woman who was surrounded by about 6 African men. You can't see their faces; they're all speaking Portuguese, and they tell her, "Hold this steel plate on your head," and she does that, and then they whack that plate and knock her unconscious, and they all 6 of them start massaging her arms and legs. This is to keep the blood flowing. And I could not watch the rest of it, but this is a real phenomenon that's out there. It's taking place, and it's not getting enough attention from law enforcement.
No, unfortunately, I guess they're understaffed, like a lot of places are, and uh, yeah, the trafficking trade is growing. I mean, these traffickers, they're making more money off of selling bodies, and I guess body parts too, than they were when they were selling drugs. And
And then,
a person can a person can be used several times, but drugs you can only use that once and it's gone.
that's a fact.
But
Yeah,
and that's sad.
there have been estimates of that the income, the illicit income out of human trafficking is probably greater than that of drugs. I don't know. I haven't done that research. Don't know
I've
how I would do it.
Yeah, I've heard that too from several different
It's
places.
incredible. I do know that the law enforcement, at least in that part of the world, when a single Cessna flies across the Atlantic, it may refuel on some island, but when it lands in West Africa, that plane has more value on it than the entire, in the case of Guinea-Bissau, for instance, which is a Portuguese-speaking country just north of Guinea, that plane has more value on it than the entire budget for the year for the entire police force. So you can imagine
Wow.
that's why they can buy off the police. The drug traffickers own those countries. I mean, In Guinea, the president's own son was caught at the border driving back from Sierra Leone with a car full of drugs and about $500,000 worth of money and gold in it. Um, and it's the Wild West. It really is the Wild West. So,
I'm sure. I'm sure it is. I mean, money. If you have enough money, you can pretty much buy anything.
yeah. I don't know if that is a full description, full enough of my own career. USAID was, as I said, the agency that got involved in everything between military and pure diplomacy. So almost anything was fair game. But the trafficking part is one of the subjects that I'm concerned enough about to try and publicize this. I was so offended last year when aid was destroyed. They called us a bunch of, Trump and Elon Musk said that we were all collectively a bunch of crooks, that we were all corrupt. And hell, I gave up 2/3 of my income to join the agency. Um, and the fact is that half of the administrators of this agency in the period I was with it were appointed by Republicans, and not a single one of them has come out in favor of it. And one of them said that all of the accusations against us were pure garbage. I mean, when they hire people, they were all mid-career. They didn't hire people straight out of school. They were mid-career people. And after they get hired, there's a big security check. It takes 6 to 9 months. They check our background. And everything we did was vetted with the Congress, with the congressional committees, with the White House, with the Office of Management of Budget, with the State Department. We weren't doing anything secret, and the idea we were skimming money off was just nonsense. So I was so mad about that. I wrote my own. I had been collecting stories over many years, and I published a book called Inside USAID, An Odyssey of Foreign Assistance, and it's a collection of tales about, what was going on in the places I lived in. Um, we can talk more about that if you wish, but it was
Go ahead and tell us a little bit about your book.
I was in some places that fell apart rather quickly and unexpectedly, and that's another reason I'm trying to get the word out about the book itself, because I don't think people in the U.S. realize how fragile the social consensus is. And I have several examples, but perhaps the best one, and this is not one I lived through, but when the Soviet Union fell apart, I don't know if you recall how surprising that was, how unexpected it. And it was because the social consensus in the Soviet Union itself was very fragile, and they didn't realize that. But all of a sudden, the whole place just dissolved. And I have lived through that in several countries. I was in Kyrgyzstan the night that I was the acting DCM. The DCM means the Deputy Chief of Mission. The real guy was on vacation, so the ambassador asked me to be his number 2 guy. And that night, there were rent-a-crowds. People were protesting in front of the White House. But most of the people in both crowds had been paid for by some very wealthy people. And the crowds were battling with each other. And the president he was an enlightened fellow. He told his troops he didn't want any deaths or injuries, so the guns were not loaded. Well, the kids figured that out. They got over the fence. They got into the White House. They ransacked it, and the president left the country. He flew to Almaty, which was about a 3-hour drive away, but he went in a helicopter, and then he ended up in Moscow teaching math. The place has never been the same. That night, the police disappeared, and kids raged through the city, burning up shops, breaking into shopping malls. It was nuts. And it was not terribly unlike Conakry when Lassana Conte died and the military started fighting each other. That's a third example. I was also in Guatemala City the very day that the president decided that his Congress was too corrupt and his Supreme Court wasn't making the kinds of decisions he wanted. So he called out the army, and he surrounded the Congress and he surrounded the Supreme Court, and they arrested everybody. Well, that didn't last long. It lasted about 2 weeks, and the guy fled to Panama with several $1 million. But because the U.S. took a strong stand and we told the army, look, you can't let this stand because if you do, we're not going to do business with you anymore. And the Army officers were making a lot of money on the side, controlling the more lucrative import and export businesses. So that didn't last. But the point is that social consensus is a fragile thing, and I don't think we are recognizing how dangerous it is here that we're so polarized now. Because to think that we're immune to this sort of thing would be pretty naive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another point I try to make in the book. The corruption angle is also something I've talked about. And my own wife was kidnapped in Kyrgyzstan
Wow.
because I was too outspoken about high level corruption, and it was in the energy sector. Uh, Electricity is the easiest thing in the world to smuggle. If your borders were built at a time when it was one big country, then there's no meters right at the border. So what was going on in Kyrgyzstan in those days is that people were on the take in both Kazakhstan to the north, which has a lot of oil, and they had the money, and Kyrgyzstan was pretty broke. So the guys that worked for the energy department in Kyrgyzstan would allow electricity to go through the wires, and they would get their money under the table from these rich people in Kazakhstan. I knew the details of this because we were involved in the energy sector trying to improve their ability to prevent households from stealing electricity, because everybody in rural Kyrgyzstan is an electrician. They all know how to steal electricity by wiring around, just connecting their homes directly to the power lines. And
Mm-hmm.
I told other donors about it, including the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and I did so in offices that, in retrospect, I now realize were bugged, because I was on a television program there. I was interviewed by a local station, and I told them I had married a Kyrgyz woman, which I did, and we're still married 20 years later. We've got 3 kids, but um,
Great.
she was my Russian teacher, and she still is. In any event, when I had that interview a week later, she was kidnapped as she came out of a hairdresser's salon. She was getting ready for the Marine Ball. Every year, these embassies put on big birthday parties for the Marines. They have Marine guards, and they have the birthday party for the Marines, and it's a big fancy dance. So she was getting ready for that. When she came out of the hairdresser, 3 young guys jumped in and took her out of town, tied her up, and she got loose eventually. And that was the end of our stay in Kyrgyzstan. The embassy said, "You got to get out of here just for your own safety's sake." But I tell that story. Corruption is out there in every country and at a very high level, and there's no reason to think that the human traffickers aren't participating in that as well, in terms of buying off law enforcement and whatnot.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm sure they are. That's why one reason why it's spreading so well is, a lot of politicians and law enforcement, they're just turning their back on it and just letting it go because, they're getting some kickback on it, getting money. And until I guess that stops, it's going to continue to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough phenomenon. One of the problems that we had and I had with the American Bar Association is there's different jurisdictions involved, and when you have crimes that a lot of it takes place at sea, the transport of these women through international waters. Um, the same major that brought the whole issue to my attention, he at one point he knew that there was a ship leaving Conakry with African women on board who were being taken north, and he was trying to get the British Navy to intercept one of these ships at Gibraltar. And the admiral up in Gibraltar just laughed at him, and he says, "How can I go out there and just stop a commercial vessel based on the phone call from some guy, even a guy at your level in the U.S. Embassy? I don't have the right to do that." And
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to try and get a search warrant, well, how do you do it, and from which country? And that's what makes international trafficking so difficult because, they're on international waters. You've got to have some pretty convincing proof, but then you've got to find a court that will take jurisdiction of it and issue some order that gives you the authority to go out and stop the boat and search it and try and find the ladies that they've hidden on the boat. And the jurisdictional issues were, once I got over the barrier of it's too hard to believe,
Mm-hmm.
the next question was, well, how could we do anything about it? The only solution that we've come up with, and when I say we, I'm still involved with Major Hatch is his name, Jason Hatch, and he is involved in a group called the Order of the Eagle. It's an old knighthood that was created by one of the kings of Georgia, the country of Georgia, and
Mm-hmm.
that group is now trying to create a radio program, and they will translate it into local languages. And the purpose of it would be to broadcast it in the countries where these ladies are recruited and try to make them aware. They don't believe everything you hear. If someone promises you a trip to the US or a free trip to Europe, it's too good to be true, and it's not going to happen, and something else far worse probably will happen. So that's all we've come up with in terms of just trying to make women in these various countries aware of it.
Yeah, the traffickers, they're very smart. They know how to groom and talk to these people to, get them to, come on board with them. And,
Mm-hmm.
they promise them money, fame, better life in another country, and it never happens.
It's a sad situation, and again, what is particularly galling, at least when USAID existed, we had people out there that were, aware of phenomena like that, and I like to say, it made us collectively wiser. When the agency was destroyed, we had 60 years worth of project documentation, and we had a whole center called the Center for Development Evaluation and Information. They took it offline, and to me, it was like burning down the library in Alexandria several thousand years ago, and a lot of wisdom went up in cyber smoke at that point, because we don't have people out there that can even learn about what's going on the ground, and let alone do anything about it. And that's particularly regretful. And you mentioned, David, that you're in different countries. I'm sure some of them probably have people there know what USAID was, and there's literally tens of thousands of careers that were destroyed when they took that agency down. It was a
Well,
political.
hopefully they'll bring it back.
I hope so. I and a lot of other people.
Well, I'm sure that not a lot, not a lot of people agree with what happened, but yeah, I don't know all the details of why they did what they did, but it's, I guess, above my pay grade, and hopefully they'll sort things out and reinstate a lot of it back once they go through the details and find, that they were doing a lot of good, and maybe they'll cut back on some of the programs that they feel that wasn't beneficial, but who knows. I quit trying to figure out the logic of government.
Yeah, it's hard to understand all of it, and I make one other point in the book about why different things became the priorities. And I think it was more of an art than a science, that we would always go into a given country and negotiate an agreement with the host government, and both sides would agree on something that seemed to make sense. We created entire industries in Central America. We, for instance, brought in a contractor who tried to grow some onions up in the mountains in Honduras, and and send them in a container to Miami. And lo and behold, yeah, we figured out that you can actually do that. And you can provide onions to the U.S. at a time when they don't have any. And 10 years later, 500,000 people are making their living doing that. And we did that with many different projects. Snow peas in Guatemala, strawberries and flowers and melons, shrimp farms. We created entire industries. So what we did was not always just humanitarian stuff. Almost anything was fair game. At one point, the environmentalists wanted to set up a corridor of national parks so animals in Central America could run back and forth without bumping into highways, or at least they'd have bridges they could go under and whatnot. And we made it happen. We got the governments together and persuaded them to create a contiguous system of national parks. When the Soviet Union did fall apart, they wanted people that could train the accountants, train the lawyers, and what private sector business was all about. And we got that job. So we had all kinds of. There was one time smoke from forest fires in northern Guatemala was floating up into Texas and Florida. And the congressman up here called us and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And, okay, well, we didn't realize we were a firefighting agency too, but that was our job. We had to, get tankers hired and oversee projects and bring in the implementers. We always work through these implementers, but we got stuff done, and it's just such a tragedy that the agency is not out there. It's not only a tragedy. I mean, almost something like there's one website that counts the number of deaths now. It's getting up close to 800,000 deaths that have happened since the agency was destroyed because of the health programs that were terminated. Entire refugee camps in Africa that used to be feeding places for some of the refugees fleeing, say, from the civil war in Sudan. Now they arrive there and there's no food, there's nobody there, it's gone. And, in the context of that, the human trafficking is one of those issues. We're not out there trying to do anything about it now.
Yeah, I'm sure that's growing without anybody monitoring it or trying to stop it. I'm sure that's growing just like it is here in the United States. The United States is getting to be one of the major countries for human trafficking.
Yeah, I told you that when I got back in 2009, I was practicing law for a while, but the most meaningful thing I did there was work on a shelter for homeless teenagers. And that was a problem I was not really aware of until I came back. But the phenomenon in this country of teenagers who either leave home, they don't get along with their parents, or they get booted out is a very big one. And in many states, and Washington State was one of these, it's a crime to shelter a homeless teenager. You have to send the kid back to his or her home. And the law doesn't contemplate, well, what if the parents don't want him back? Or what if the kid just refuses? If you're 18 or older, you can go to the gospel mission or the VFW mission or wherever. You can spend the night there as an adult. But as a teenager, it's illegal. It's illegal to help that teenager. It's a misdemeanor in Washington State to help a homeless teenager unless you have a license from the state. So that was our goal, and we got a lot. We had a big fundraising event, and we finally got the county to give us a license. And that was after, even though I was in USAID perhaps almost 30 years, that single shelter that I helped set up when I was briefly retired is something I'm more proud of than anything I ever did in USAID. But it's still there. It's 15 years later. It's still up and running.
Wow. It's sad that they wasn't able to help teenagers, and that's a lot of times where it starts. It's prostitution and
that's right.
And trafficking is through runaways or maybe well, I call them perverts, groomed some kid or child through the internet to get them to rebel against their parents and leave, and then they ended up on the streets, and without the smarts on how to survive, and they end up turning to drugs and prostitution just to survive, and then have the courts and the government not helping them.
Mm-hmm.
That just adds to the problem.
Yeah.
Well, thankfully, organizations like yourself and all like that, just trying to step up and fill the gap and help these teenagers.
Yeah, well, a lot of the big cities do have licensed shelters for homeless youth, but it's a process to get that kind of license, and it's at least where I was in southeastern Washington State. Um, that was near where the Columbia and the Snake Rivers come together. It's not near any real big city, and yeah, it's kind of about 250,000 people there, but I'm sure there are many other communities in the U.S. that have the same issue. But you go into Baltimore or New York or Portland, Oregon, Seattle, you can find shelters for teenagers, but certainly not where I was. And I'm sure that problem is still a big one. And like you say, that when particularly a girl is homeless, prostitution is a tempting way to make a survival.
Oh yeah, it is, because you got all these perverts out there that are looking for teenagers or even preteens to use them and abuse them and sexually and otherwise. It's not only girls. It's there's a decent percentage of boys too that are trapped into the trafficking and prostitution.
Yeah.
By whatever reasons. Well, tell us where we can get your book.
Well, it's on Amazon, it's Barnes and Noble. If you just Google Inside USAID, again, it's an odyssey. It's different stories. I mean, every country I lived in was a little different. So I spend some time in the chapters. At the beginning, I'll give sort of a broad overview of the agency itself and the kinds of things we did. I don't try to, make it a complete history of the agency by any means, but I do give enough background that I think people can understand what the agency was. We were prohibited from bragging about what we did in the U.S. There was a law that said we couldn't spend any money for publicity within the United States, and that was to prevent. I guess the guy that introduced that law, Hickenlooper was the name of the amendment. So it was some congressman named Hickenlooper. It came out of the 60s or early 70s before I joined the agency. I joined in 87. So we couldn't brag about what we were doing locally. They didn't want us influencing our own budget. They wanted our budget to come out of, needs that were identified by Congress and by the executive branch only. And they didn't want USAID even talking about, why we might need more money to do what we were doing. One year I remember two B-1 bombers went down. One of them crashed in Texas and one of them crashed in Montana. Each of those planes cost more than $500,000 or $500 million, not $500 million to build. Each of those planes, that number was bigger than all of the foreign aid we were giving to sub-Saharan Africa in each of those years. It was a drop compared to the military budget. It was a drop in the bucket, and that's one of the points I make in the book. I mean, we were spending money overseas, but most of it actually came back to the U.S. because we were hiring people here to go out there and meet with people and teach them how to do things differently, whether it was in tax collection or hospital management or running court systems or teaching farmers to do things differently, teaching business associations how to lobby together for changes they needed in order to be more successful in their business, how to repair water systems. I mean, the list, I could just go on and on and on, but it was way more than just health projects and disaster responses. It was, like I said, anything that was in between pure diplomacy and military. And God knows, there's a lot of stuff that we wish could happen overseas, and that was our tool to do it. So
Hmm.
anyway, the book goes through, gives you the big picture of why we existed and the kinds of things we did. And then I talk about the various places I was. And as I said before, many of them fell apart rather quickly. I was in Haiti right after the military government had actually told the soldiers to go out and shoot people while they were standing in line to vote. And I remember taking the shuttle car from the hotel I was staying in up in Port-au-Prince, which is way up on the mountain above. Uh, the hotel was in Pétionville, which is above Port-au-Prince, and I drove down on this narrow little road in a bulletproof car, and we were passing bodies on the shoulder of the road from the violence that had gone on for those elections. The stories were just unbelievable at times. And I opened the book with a story of how we were trying to literally give away by financing $20 million. And this was to the newly existing country of Eritrea in north of Ethiopia. They had just fought one of the longest civil wars in history. And it's a high altitude country. During World War II, we had the U.S. Army had a big listening post there to capture electronic signals from all over the Middle East and Europe, and it's in a very strategic location near the mouth of the Red Sea. So the U.S. was trying to position itself as a friendly nation to this new regime because it wasn't clear that they were going to align with anybody, and that was in the days of not that long after the Cold War had ended, but I was down there trying to find somebody that would take $20 million worth of imports. They were going to have to buy stuff in the U.S., but whatever they needed to get their country back on its feet, we were willing to finance up to $20 million worth of imports of products from the United States, provided they were going to be used for peaceful purposes. And that was basically it. So I go around, the entire government was located in the barracks that had been built, 40 years earlier to house the soldiers who were running that listening post. And it was an old bunch of buildings, semi-falling apart. And I walked into one big building, walked down the hall. There was a little office, and there was this 8.5 by 11-inch white piece of paper that was scotch taped to the wall, to the door, and it said Ministry of Education. So I knock on the door, I go in, and the whole ministry is there. There's 4 people. And 2 of them were Eritrean women. The women fought in that civil war, and they were in the army. They were dressed up in their army uniforms. One guy had his feet on the desk, and they had their rifles next to him. And I made my pitch. I said, what USAID was, why I was there, and I said, we've got 20 million bucks for you if you want. And they looked at me and they said, no, we don't want it. Because if we take it, it looks like you're bribing us to do something. I said, well, it might look that way, but look, you can tell me what you're going to do. We'd like to help you, get this country up and running as a real country instead of some leftover battleground, because it was a terrible civil war. I did that for about a month, going around trying to offer this to various ministries, and they all said, no, we don't want it. I said, to hell with it. I went back to Nairobi, where I had a job as a lawyer there. I had been temporarily designated as a program officer to go get this program off the ground, but I didn't do it. And that's the opening story in the book. And the point I make there is that a lot of the times I found myself in like some sort of never land. It's just unreal, the kinds of things that you can see happen overseas.
And I know that a lot of people complain about the United States. They can't get the newest iPhone or designer clothes, but we got it made over here.
Yeah.
And
we were living at the intersection of the modern world and the rural world as it existed like 200 years ago. I remember my secretaries in the office in Nairobi. I was not in the embassy that got bombed, but I was about 2 blocks away from it. And my secretaries, both of them came from rural African villages. Both of them could put bottles of water on their head and walk around the office balancing these jugs of water on their head. because they learned to do it as little girls because that's how they had to go get their water. But they were working in a modern office building, and I don't know, the intersection of the third world and the modern world was quite an eye opener.
I'm sure it was, and I think it would help a lot of people if they had the opportunity, like you, to spend some time in some of these other countries and just see how how other people live.
It was
And
never boring. And I look back
I'm
on it,
sure.
the downside was I didn't put down roots. So that's why I ended up back here in DC instead of back in my hometown because my roots became the people I worked with instead of any particular place. And I'm still somewhat of a global nomad. At least I have the mentality of a global nomad. Uh,
Yeah.
that's what the book's about. It's about the places I was in and some of the issues that came up and some of the crazy things that happened during my own career.
Well, hopefully, we can get some people to take a look at your book and buy it. And they can learn a little bit about how the rest of the world is. It's not always ice cream and television. I'm
Still
sure
learning.
a lot of places you live that don't even know what a television or ice cream is.
Yeah. Well, one of the things a phrase that I use early in the book, one project officer told me once, he said, we all work on the forces, on the margin of forces we barely understand. And in my old age, I'm starting to question, whether these national borders are actually helping us or hindering us, because what I see going on now with that recent visit um, to China, it looked like Louis the 14th had come to town. And I talk about some of the presidential visits we had when I was in different places. It's absolutely amazing the kind of money and the cost of these things. It's like the king himself is showing up, and
Mm-hmm.
but what we've done with these borders is we've facilitated enormous militaries that are by law required to respond to the whims of a single individual, a really, the guy at the top, whether it's Vladimir Putin, whether it's President Xi in China, or whether it's our own president. And those militaries, they all were created because, well, we need it because the guy next door has one. But now what
Mm-hmm.
we've done is we've got huge military establishments around the globe that are not going to be directed by any kind of democratic vote. They're going to be directed by the whims of their particular commander in chief. And I'm now starting to question, whether these borders even belong or doing any good, frankly. I think they may be counterproductive, but that's another topic entirely.
Yeah. Well, you have anything else you want to share about the trafficking and the body parts?
I guess we didn't talk about the bride kidnapping business.
Oh
And
no, yeah, you mentioned that. Go ahead. I forgot
well,
all about that.
um, I'll one of the tales I talk about is the phenomenon of bride kidnapping in Central Asia. And that was also something that was unbelievable to me when I first got there. And I didn't start the project, but the guy before me had actually given a grant to the University of Central Asia out of Vienna to come to town and film four families as they went through the process of allowing their son to go out and literally take a bride. And these kids don't date in the rural parts of China, of Kyrgyzstan, sorry. It was a tradition in the old days before the Soviet Union that this is how the Kyrgyz rural men got their wives. They would literally ride their horses out and just grab a woman and bring her back to his house. And the way it's happening now, they don't ride horses out there, but they get their buddies together and they'll go out with a car. And the first family that was shown in this film that we financed, the man, he's a young guy, and he's getting dressed up. He's shined his shoes. He's looking good. He's got a suit on, and his grandmother is there, and she's saying, "Don't get a pretty one. I don't want a pretty one. I want one that's going to work." And then the film crew follows the guy. He gets in a car with his buddies. They go out to a bus stop, and a school bus is pulled up, and kids are standing in line ready to get on the bus. He and his buddies get out, and they grab a teenage girl out of the line, and they bring her back in the car. She's kicking and screaming, saying, "No, I've got to go to school. I've got a test." And they tell her, "Honey, your school days are over." They take her back to the groom's home. They put her in a corner. She is surrounded by the groom's elder women relatives, his aunts, his grandma, his two grandmas, presumably, and other, women friends of the groom's family. They surround this girl and they say, "Put on the scarf. That will indicate that you've accepted your fate. We all did it. This is how you need to do it." And in that case, she did ultimately accept the scarf. But there are times when the girls refuse to do it. They're determined not to get married. And sometimes they're allowed to go home. Sometimes the ladies will come out and tell the man, "Go in there and do what you need to do." And that means go in there and rape that woman. And then her parents won't take her home, won't accept her if she does try to run back. We knew there was one of my colleagues who'd been in the Peace Corps in Kyrgyzstan. He was friends with a home that was occupied by several women who were in those circumstances. They couldn't go home to their own home, and they didn't get married, so they were living with each other in this home. But there were four of these families that were interviewed, and the same film crew went back a year later and interviewed the women, or three of them,
Mm-hmm.
because the fourth one had committed suicide.
Wow.
I have personally sat in rooms surrounded by Western dressed women and men, and I've heard these ladies, young college age women, tell me, "This is our tradition. This is how we do it. If we didn't do it this way, we wouldn't have families." And the men would say the same. "This is our tradition." And I said, "Well, slavery used to be a tradition out here too. Does that make it right?" But it's an amazing phenomenon, but it's still going on. And it was illegal, and it was suppressed during the Soviet Union. It is still illegal, but it's not suppressed. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the domestic version of trafficking that's going on in so many places in Central Asia now.
Oh, yeah, and it's happening in other parts of the world too. I mean, child brides, you know, 10-year-old girls being forced to marry old men, and so it's another part of trafficking in a way.
There are times
Forced
when,
marriages.
yeah, sometimes the kids would arrange it. They make it look like it was a kidnapping because they wanted to get married, and that's how they would do it.
Mm-hmm.
But we estimated something like 2/3 of the rural marriages were done that way. And for me, it hit home particularly. My own wife's elder sister. My wife is Kyrgyz, but I didn't kidnap her. But
Okay.
her older sister was, and I mean, the guy knew her. She knew who the guy was. She had not agreed to get married to this guy, but 30, 40 years later, they're still married and they've got kids. That's how it happened. It's a real phenomenon.
Just these customs, different parts of the world, just are so different from ours, and
Sure.
that we just can't understand how you could be forced to be married, and but it's normal in some countries. That's the way life is, and we as Americans just don't understand that, because we're all into the freedom and freedom of choice and all like that, but a lot of countries, they don't have the freedom that we do.
Yeah, and we don't have the religious impact that used to direct human behavior like we once had. The kids are not willing to let their parents make the decisions for them, so they have to make so many decisions on their own. In that particular example in Kyrgyzstan, at least the ladies are not being allowed to make that decision. They're more like they just accept it as a reality when they do accept it. Well, I thank you, David, for letting me ramble on about
Oh, no
using.
problem. No problem. I think we learned a lot about other countries and how they work on top of the trafficking. And what really is shocking to me is the body parts, the sale of those. And that's going to be another topic that I'm going to be covering on my podcast pretty soon is organ harvesting.
Yeah, I'll send you the link to that book I mentioned. Or
Yeah,
Death
please
to
do.
Order. Killed to Order. That's the name of it.
Yeah, please do. I'd like to look at that book and maybe have the author of that book on my show. Okay. Well, thank you, and I'll let you know when this goes out.
Super. Well, good luck with the editing. I'm sure you'll have a lot of stuff to reshuffle or whatever, but I appreciate the opportunity. And
All
I'll
right.
check out
Thank
your own
you.
too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
That's it for our show for today. Thank you for joining in. I hope you were able to learn something today that may help you understand what is going on around you, allowing you to be aware of the dangers to yourself and perhaps a loved one, and maybe inspire you to get involved in the fight to stop human trafficking. Please follow me on Facebook, subscribe to my podcast, email me at davidjstory.com with your questions or comments. Music by tunereel.com. And please remember, always watch your six and others too.